This week we're taking up the topic of change in curriculum. One of the things that we need to recognize is that the process of curriculum development is really at the heart the process of change. So some of the theories that underlie change we need to understand and be willing to apply when we try to design and implement a new curriculum. First, we're going to look at the impediments to change, or the reasons why either we ourselves individually or the groups that we're working with are just not quite so willing to change. What I'm going to do in this slide is just real briefly outline what these impediments are, and then we'll look at each one in a little bit greater detail. First, there's paradigm paralysis. Now, the reason we have for resisting change is a fear of the unknown. A lot of times organizations, schools operate in a climate of mistrust, and that climate causes a resistance to change. And of course, a lot of times we just don't want to attempt new things because we're afraid we're going to fail. We just don't have the confidence we need that the plan is going to succeed. And many times we just simply are resistant to change because we are afraid of what it is going to do to us personally, or what it will do to the group that we belong to, that we might lose a status, or it may jeopardize our job security. And of course, we can't ever underestimate the power of peer pressure or the disruption of traditions and groups. We just like to hang on to those things that we have come to hold very dear. Not to mention personality conflicts. Very often people will resist change because, well, it wasn't their idea, and they don't want to see the other person whose idea it was succeed. And very frequently, one of the reasons why plans don't work out is because, well, the plans weren't made very carefully in the first place. Let's look at paradigm paralysis. This might be a new concept for you. Actually, paradigm paralysis refers to a pattern of thinking, a way we have of thinking about certain concepts or things. The word paradigm comes to us from the Greek, and it means literally a pattern. Let me give you an example of a paradigm and see if this might help us to understand the concept. You know how in our country we drive on the right side of the road, and we grow up riding in cars on the right side of the road, and when we start driving, we drive on the right side of the road, and we think that's just the way that it should be. In fact, this has become so ingrained in our way of thinking. Our brain is literally wired to believe that the only way to drive is on the right side of the road. Now, of course, when you go to other countries, the United Kingdom, for example, or in some places in the Caribbean, you know that this isn't true. They drive on the left side of the road. Well, this is a paradigm, because when you try to make the transfer from the right side of the road to the left side of the road, you find that you don't make it quite so easily. You think left side of the road, but when you pull out, you automatically gravitate to the right side of the road. I don't know how many times when I've been traveling overseas that I've almost been run over, because when I step out on the street to cross the street, I automatically look left instead of right, because I expect the traffic to be coming from the left or the right side of the road. Well, in some countries it's not. It's coming from the other side, and I don't know how many times I've narrowly escaped disaster. That's a paradigm. Now think of the paradigms we have in our schools today. Larger schools are probably going to be better. Interscholastic athletics are a necessary part of secondary education. Perhaps you can think of some others. These are just ways that we have of thinking, and we think that there can be no other way. That's a paradigm. And when we introduce change, and that change runs up against a paradigm, it's going to be very, very difficult to implement. Another reason why change is so hard is because people fear the unknown. This happens when a radical change, a very different curriculum in our case, is introduced without any preparation. What happens is the rumor mill becomes the primary source of information because people really don't know what's going on. They fear what they don't know. And consequently, the way they respond to that is by resisting the change. Another is the mistrust that is sometimes prevalent in some schools. One of the things we have to realize is change requires risk. There's no way around that. And we accept risk only when we're comfortable, when we're confident that the risk is worth taking, that the chances are good that the risk that we're taking will be successful. Well, if we don't trust the people we're working with, we're not willing to take those risks. What we have to do if we're going to be in an environment that is conducive to change is that we've got to create a school climate that is built upon trust. Another reason why change is so difficult, especially curriculum change, is the fear of failure. And remember that failure comes from self-doubt, and self-doubt stems from a lack of preparation. One of the ways to overcome this is to make sure that we maximize participation in the initial decision-making process, and we provide for the necessary professional development that people will have to implement the new program. If they don't feel they're going to be ready for the change, that's going to induce self-doubt. That self-doubt will cause the fear of failure, and the fear of failure will be the resistance to the change. We can overcome that by participation in the decision-making process and adequate professional development. Another reason why change is so hard in schools, especially when we're trying to implement curriculum, is what is perceived to be a loss of status or job security. One of the things that we do when we change is we upset the bureaucracy, which can result in real or perceived shifts in power bases. Let me give you an example. A few years ago I was consulting with a middle school that was going to restructure, and in effect we were going to be doing away with the traditional academic departments, the departments of English and Math and Science and Social Studies, and we were going to be forming families of about 80 students per family, and each family would be headed by a team of 4 teachers, and that team of teachers would be interdisciplinary. Well, let me ask you, what do you think that the chairs of the academic departments thought about that idea? They were no longer going to be chairs. Consequently, they resisted the introduction of the idea. A loss of status will be a very strong resistor to change that we introduce. And of course there's peer pressure. Never ever underestimate the need to conform. And we're really no exception. We may think of ourselves as independent thinkers, but actually we do like to be in step with our professional colleagues. And we will listen to those voices of conformity when we introduce new curriculum ideas. And how many times have you heard someone say, you know, we've never done it that way before. We've always done it this way. Well, it is that disruption of custom or tradition that is the impediment to change. And what we have to do when we're introducing a new curriculum or a new curriculum policy is to anticipate this as a resistance and have an understanding of the reasons that would be given for preserving tradition so that we can address those reasons. And when we're dealing with change, never underestimate the power or the effect of the ego. Sometimes people who are deeply invested in a curriculum, maybe because they were involved in the design of that curriculum, they're going to take it personally if change is introduced that might affect the curriculum that they worked so hard to put into place. They're not looking so much at the new program, they're looking at the criticism. And finally, poor planning is a reason why some people resist change. We're not going to simply take the risks that are involved in implementing a new program if we don't think all of the details of that program have been carefully thought out. Even though it's so hard to change, and we can think of all of these reasons why perhaps we shouldn't change, we still need to recognize that some change is inevitable. Now, the wisdom is in knowing what parts of our schools and our school programs we should change, and what parts of our schools and school programs we need to preserve. In the second part of the PowerPoint presentation for this week, what we're going to look at are ways that we can overcome these impediments to change, and also we're going to look at some characteristics of effective change agents. So you can go ahead and close this show now and then move on to part 2. Now what we'd like to do in continuing our discussion of change theory is look at some of the ways we have of overcoming this resistance to change. And what we're going to do in this slide is look at some of the ways that we can address the resistance to change, and then after we've listed all of the points, we'll talk about each one in a little bit greater detail. First, there's participation. This involves identifying all of the people who are going to be affected by the change and then getting them involved in the decision-making process and the planning process from the very beginning. And that, of course, requires communication, two-way communication. It also means we need to have a realistic idea of what kind and levels of support are going to be needed to implement the change. And we need to figure out ways in which we can motivate the people who are going to be affected by change to take that first jump, to take on the risks. Careful planning, both at the strategic and operational levels, are going to be important. And of course, sometimes what we can do to get people to change is just simply coerce them to change. I don't want you to think that I'm recommending that actually, but we do want to recognize it as one of the ways that people can be made to change, and we want to look at some of the advantages and disadvantages. First, let's look at participation. What participation does is it reduces the fear of the unknown, one of the impediments to change, and it does that by building ownership and commitment. If we've been involved in a decision, we want to make sure that that decision works. And if we're involved in the planning process, we've got input into how the decision gets implemented, and we're going to be willing to take on the risks and also deal with some of the frustrations and uncertainties that come along as we're implementing that change. That only occurs if we're involved, or if we are leading the program that involves change, we get people involved. And the second is communication. And we have to remember that communication is a two-way process. Actually, communication occurs in complex organizations like schools. It occurs from multiple sources of origin of communication, and of course the communication is broadcast to a multiplicity of locations. In other words, communication is a network. It's not just simply dissemination of information. And what this does, it's a part of the process of building participation, is that it creates an atmosphere of trust. If we make sure that people know what's going on and they're getting accurate information and reliable information, then they're going to be willing to trust the outcome. And the third thing we have to do is make sure that we've got sufficient resources, both in terms of the material, the fiscal support, the personnel support. When we have a convincing case that we've got the support to actually implement a program effectively, what we're doing is helping to combat the fear of failure, one of the impediments to change. Also, we're reducing the element of self-doubt, another one of the impediments to change. If we know that we've got the resources in place, then it's a matter of simply making wise use of those resources and following through with our plan. And of course, one of the things that we can do to motivate people to change is to just make sure we've got a reward system. Providing motivation is essential, but we need to make sure that the rewards, if they're extrinsic only, have a downside. Because what extrinsic awards only do is, well, it bypasses ownership, and it makes constituents support the program only as far as the rewards motivate them to. What we want to try to do instead is to get people intrinsically motivated, provide some intrinsic rewards to get them to take the risks and to deal with the frustrations and hardship that the process of change involves. And that's better accomplished actually by participating and communicating and ensuring that the support is going to be necessary to implement the change effectively. Where rewards can work, but they do have a downside. And we need to make sure that any process of change is going to have to involve some planning. Of course, we can make the mistake of making our plans so detailed that we really can't respond to some of the uncertain directions that the program has to take. But then if we don't have a general idea of where we're headed, then we're likely to end up just about anywhere. What a good plan does is it reduces fear, and it also ensures appropriate logistical support. We can't have the support system in place unless we've made the plans to know exactly what we're going to be needing. Now I'd like to comment on coercion. Research has shown us that actually this is the method that is used most often to get us to change, and unfortunately, even though it might work, the effects are at best temporary. What happens with coercion is that it breeds resentment and cynicism, and as soon as the negative reinforcement is relaxed, then everybody snaps back to the way they did it before. We create the illusion of change when we coerce people to change. Actually, what we haven't done is motivated a change in their behavior. All we've done is simply control their behavior, and once our control mechanisms are removed, then they revert to their previous behavior. What we need to do is to look at the other ways that we have of resisting change if we want that change to be effective and long-lasting. Now let's look at some characteristics of effective change agents. One of my hopes with this course actually is that you'll become, in a short while, a leader in your school community. You'll be serving on a curriculum committee, maybe find yourself in a leadership position, and you'll be wanting to introduce programs that will change things the way they are. And I'd like you to simply, as we talk about each of these points, assess yourself to see whether or not you are or you can become one of these effective change agents. One of the first things that we know about effective change agents by looking at organizational research is that they are professionally and technically competent. Well, actually, they're more than competent. They have an expertise. People know that they can trust them for knowing and being able to evaluate the best way of doing things. Now, that doesn't mean that the decision is left to them, but it means that they are capable of providing the professional guidance that the change process is going to need. Also, they have an extraordinary degree of credibility with their constituents, and this is necessary because change requires an atmosphere of trust. The people who are going to be looking to a change agent for leadership are going to know that that person has the organization's interests at heart and not just simply self-interests. They also have a high degree of interpersonal intelligence. That means that they're very effective communicators, very effective in communicating their ideas in large groups, very effective in communicating in small groups, where ideas get sorted out and fleshed out, and we use a lot of analysis and evaluation. They're also very good communicators in one-on-one, where persuasion and a lot of convincing has to occur. Another characteristic of effective change agents is that they have a high degree of intrapersonal intelligence. This is what Howard Gardner refers to as knowing yourself. That's because change requires a great deal of emotional energy. Many times you have to endure criticism, and you can do that only when you know that the course is set in the right direction, and when you deal with people who are trying to undermine or redirect the change, you have the strength of your convictions and the self-confidence that is necessary to stay the course. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't listen to people along the way, because you see, interpersonal intelligence needs to interact effectively with interpersonal intelligence. Let's look at some steps to managing change now. One of the first things that we have to do is just diagnose the current situation, and that includes, most importantly, we have to assess whether or not it's really necessary for change. One of the things that I think we are properly criticized for in education is this bandwagon mentality, sort of the innovation of the year, and oftentimes we haven't really effectively implemented one program that we're in the middle of before we jump ship, and then we're off trying to implement another program. What we need to do is to diagnose the current situation, which includes a needs assessment of our students and our other school patrons, clientele. We've got to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what our goals are. We need to understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish in this program, who all has to be involved in the decision-making process and the planning process. We also have to make sure that we've got the levels of support necessary to actually implement whatever change it is that we're considering. All of this is diagnosing the current situation. Once we've figured out that we really do need to change and we have a sense of where we might be headed, then we need to envision what the new program is actually going to look like once we get it implemented. This goes back to the session we had on strategic planning when we talked about the importance of using concrete imagery to describe the vision of the desired state. Only then can we actually begin to set the goals and state in fairly explicit terms what the mission of our new program is going to be. And then we develop the strategies that we would be using in the action plans. Now, again, this sort of goes back and reviews the discussion we had on strategic planning. What I mean by developing strategies is we decide what has to occur and how we're going to actually get that event to occur in order to reach our goal. For example, if we're going to implement a new curriculum, probably somewhere in that process professional development is going to play a key part. So we've got to structure into the planning process the professional development of the teachers and the counselors and the paraprofessionals, whoever else is going to be involved. And of course, we can't forget the importance to stabilize the new condition. Again, going back to the first point, a lot of times we just sort of jump aimlessly from one program to another, from this kind of textbook to that kind of textbook, this sort of assessment program to that sort of assessment program. And we don't really know if what we were doing was working or not, because we've already jumped off to some new situation that we're trying to create. We really don't know whether or not we're headed in the right direction unless we let the new condition stabilize. And of course, going back to the conclusion of the first part of our presentation on change, the real wisdom here is figuring out what it is that we want to preserve at the heart of our school, and then recognize those areas that are within our sphere of influence that we actually can change, that we have the expertise to change, the resources to change, the will to change, and then direct our efforts to change on those, because it is by changing those things that are part of our environment, we are really able to conserve those parts of the school that are most dear to us. Now I think it's time to turn back to the reading assignment, and you can complete the reading response. And then of course we'll have another discussion this week, and I'll see you in the discussion room. And as always, don't hesitate to give me an email message or a telephone call if there's anything I can do to help clarify any of the assignments or answer any of your questions.